For a quarter century, duelists have been giving it their all, trying to win each and every single game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And from the start, dragons have been at the forefront of gameplay. Ever since we saw Grandpa show us his Blue Eyes White Dragon, there is no doubt about it, dragons have been the most impactful and prominent typing across all of Yu-Gi-Oh! But after 2 decades and many different cards being released, it's hard to know which of these dragons is truly the best. So with this series, we'll be looking at different types of cards and then ranking them on a tier list based off of several different criteria. We will look at a card's overall power level, its power level compared to its time, its legacy, as well as its long-standing impact on the formats. And with all that, we will have our best card of that type. In this case, it'll be dragons. Before we begin, let's see if your tier lists look anything like mine. Rank your #1 most impactful and powerful dragon of all time right now in the comments, and let's see if yours is what mine is. As well, if you enjoy this type of content, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below telling me that you enjoy this type of ranking content, and let me know if you want to see any other specific types to be ranked in the future. So for the dragon class, I've split it up into 4 different tiers. We got our tier 3, our tier 2, our tier 1, and then I have the top 3 dragons. And now dragons are a hard group to class because there are so many powerful ones, and many of them are kind of pairs, or they work together, or as an entire archetype. So for some of these, I did cheat a little bit, and I classified them into 1 card, and you'll see what I mean very shortly. And in my tier 3 section, to start us off, in one of the most powerful dragons of all time, it is actually 2 dragons, the Evolzars, Yugioh and Dolka. Both barely considered dragons, although do find themselves sharing a weakness to electric virus. These dragons require 2 level 4 dinosaur monsters, 1 summon, then act as a negate, Dolka negating monsters up to twice, and Yugioh negating summons or spells and traps once. They were released in 2011, and ever since then have been a somewhat threat to the metagame. Anytime dinosaurs have been remotely playable, these cards have been huge offenders in the playability for dinosaurs. The release of Yugioh and Dolka firmly cemented in the XYZ era in 2011, with Dino Rabbit taking over the synchro plant scene and really bringing us into a new age of Yu-Gi-Oh! But the impacts of these dino cards didn't end there, as we saw them regain play during COVID, just before and just after, with miscellaneous swords and a bunch of other new dinosaur support cards.
And obviously, this card is the reason why Dinosaurs is playable, his triple miscellaneous.
It is without a doubt in my mind that if new dinosaurs continue to get released, these cards will see play once again. Even by modern standards, they have not been outclassed, and if you were to reprint this with generic typing for other types or themes or whatever, they would for sure see play. They are fantastic cards that stand the test of time. Now I'm going to take us forward in time a couple of years, and we've got one of the most powerful dragons being used in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Hot Red Dragon Archifiend King Calamity. That is a mouthful. When this card is synchro summoned, you can activate this effect, and for the rest of the turn, your opponent cannot activate cards or effects on the field. Your opponent cannot activate cards or effects in response to this card's activation either. Your opponent's is kind of just screwed. It is non-negotiable that when this card hits the field, the game is likely over there and then. There are very few other cards that have had the ability to end the game on the spot as blatantly as this card. It also rocks a ginormous attack value that will guarantee that your opponent will lose on the following turn when they have to eventually pass back to you. The biggest downside of this card is its effectiveness only really comes during your opponent's turn. However, there are many ways to summon it on your opponent's turn, so that downside really isn't a downside, more just very clear with what this card is meant to do. Despite it being one of the best finisher cards in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! I can't rank it any higher on the list, however, because other cards have proved to be more impactful for their period, having less setup required, and also still being more powerful and ultimately being more impactful on the game. Next up, we're going to move on to another sort of signer dragon and also synchro monster, Ancient Fairy Dragon, also in my tier 3 dragon section. Ancient Fairy Dragon is a card so powerful it has had an errata and been on the ban list before, and despite that is still a powerful card in the current metagame, just waiting for its chance to be in a top tier deck once again. It has seen play in several different strategies over the years, being able to destroy any field spell to then add another one from your deck to your hand, while also giving the ability to special summon a monster from the hand, setting up almost any combo that's deemed necessary. And as the power level of field spells only continue to increase, this card's utility will also only just go up. It's seen play in stuff like Dragon Link, Spirals, Adventure decks, and even the good old Dragon Ruler deck from 2013. That also rears its ugly head in degenerate FTKs. However, Ancient Fairy Dragon is largely held back by its surroundings, only being as good as the field spells that exist within the format and the tuners that allow its summon, which I guess can be true of any synchro, But this really requires a lot more to be just right for this card to see its play. But when it's good, it's damn good. Next on the list, we've got the card that started it all, the Blue Eyes White Dragon, which, yes, by modern standards is far from a playable card. However, you cannot doubt that with the amount of support cards surrounding Blue Eyes, it is still technically a very impactful card. With new powerful Blue Eye support around the corner, this card will once again likely see its way back into the metagame. It doesn't feel like Blue Eyes has been a very big presence in Yu-Gi-Oh's competitive scene, but it does pop up again and again as an option for decks to play in, whether it be White Stone plus Trade-In being used in Dragon Ruler decks for synchro plays and for fodder, or being used for draw power with cards, constants, and Trade-In in Exodia-based decks, or it being used in a Blue Eyes deck, like the one that won the World Championship in 2016, or likely what's going to happen in a few months with the new Blue Eyes structure deck that is quite powerful. There's also no denying the impact and legacy this card has. It is probably the most famous Yu-Gi-Oh card ever, and I don't think that will change. And there's also one other unique thing about Blue Eyes White Dragon. In order to maintain its reign as the most powerful monster in the game, Konami has printed monsters with higher attack points, but not normal monsters. So if you go look at all the normal monsters that exist in Yu-Gi-Oh, you'll find that nothing surpasses the mighty Blue Eyes White Dragon. But if Blue Eyes is the card that everybody loves, let's talk about its antithesis, a card that is like the demonic mirroring of Blue Eyes White Dragon. Jump 20 years in the future and we got Snake Eyes Flamebird's Dragon, which technically is supposed to be like Blue Eyes, I guess, in lore, or I don't know what it is, but yeah, this card is insane. It is the card dominating the current format, and it's hard to say what this card's legacy will be because it likely will be banned or the cards around it will be butchered in order to make sure it doesn't remain threats. The card itself has the incredible ability to remove any monster on the field or graveyard, or set up negates in the opponent's turn, while also having the ability to summon any 2 level 1 fires from the grave. It's necessary for several different combos to play around hand traps, to OTK, to set up interrupts, and do pretty much anything you see fit. The card is no doubt broken. And even in the modern climate where cards are more powerful, Flamebird stands above the rest as something that is extremely dangerous once it's the field, while also not being that hard to get there. And lastly, for our tier 3 dragons, we got another powerhouse boss monster, Boral and Dragon. Something that is not just for the rocket theme, but also playable in other themes. A 3500 attack monster that can attack everything, while also being immune to your opponent's destruction effects and from being targeted by your opponent's monster effects. There are many formats where this card is a fantastic finisher and there just aren't good outs to deal with it. It can largely define matchups, and for a long time when we were planning around how to play against and beat Dragon Link, you had to make sure you had an effective way to deal with this threat. But beyond that, we've also seen it being used in other capacities, where like Snake Eye players like Shuping Zhu have used Pentastag plus Boral and Dragon to combo attack over your opponent's monsters in defense mode and OTK them with piercing damage. So even without the negate effects it provides when rocket monsters are in play, this 3500 attack towers-like monster is no weakling. Its ease of summoning as well as powerful protection abilities mean that this card will likely see play in future decks even if they aren't dragon related throughout future metagames, we just haven't seen it yet. Alright, let's move on to the tier 2 dragon monsters, and this one is filled with a lot more legacy monsters that have really proved dominance within their metagames. For the first 3, let's talk about some that were extremely famous when I went to my first ever YCS over a decade ago. Synchro related dragons such as Black Rose Dragon, a level 7 synchro that once summoned can destroy all monsters on the field. This card was released over 15 years ago now, and at that point in time, that ability to nuke the field so flexibly and easily was not to be underestimated. It shaped a lot of players' decision making when they went about building their decks, as well as how to play out their turns, knowing that the chance of a field nuke was always present. It's a card that has seen play in several formats, pretty much until synchros themselves stopped being super relevant. But even then, when synchro decks have seen play, this card has popped up from time to time, including right now, where Tenpais use Black Rose Dragon as an option to nuke the field when they can't go for their OTK lines. This Signer Dragon really has it all, being one of the most powerful cards of the format it's in, lasting for a really long time and showing up in several and many different decks as a staple and unique to certain decks and formats, as well as being just a legendary card that everybody knows about. And with Black Rose in the mind, there's also one card that is well known to summon it more than anything else, Debris Dragon. While mostly forgotten by the current players because many cards mimic Debris Dragon's effect, which on normal summon revives a 500 attack lower monster from the graveyard. It being a tuner then means you can synchro summon for a plethora of different options. Debris Dragon has seen play in several different decks, from Synchro Plants to X-Sabers to the Dragon Rulers. For years, this was one of the best tuners around, and if you wanted access to play high-level synchro monsters and you had the access to low attack monsters already in your deck, then Debris Dragon made perfect sense. It was great for reviving monsters that had graveyard effects because you'd be able to trigger it once again, like Dandelion. And the combos involved using 1-for-1 Dandy Debris, or Debris Dandy, or Debris Card Trooper are famous that even a decade later, most players know what you're talking about when you mention Debris Dragon. This card has also been on the ban list several times, and despite never being actually banned, has fluctuated at the number of legal copies several times, as it's been quite a dangerous threat, even after Konami thought it was no longer a huge threat. Debris Dragon's power is largely rooted in the power of the dragons it can summon, and one other dragon is next in the list that Debris Dragon puts out incredibly easily as well, and one of my favorites of all time, Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. Also belonging in the Tier 2 section, this card is phenomenal. Level 9 Synchro requiring 1 tuner plus 2 or more non-tuner monsters. 1 Synchro summon lets you banish a card from your opponent's hand, field, and or graveyard. That triple threat is still good by modern standards. It's just maybe not the easiest card to summon right now. At any time a deck can summon this card consistently, it will do so. This card has fluctuated on the ban list for years because of that fact. When this card is summoned, it's a problem, especially when multiple get summoned because it's not once per turn, and you get to rip apart your opponent's hand. Back in the day when this card is summoned, it usually meant the game was probably going to be over soon. The massive swing in both value and resources was insurmountable. Even when a new form years later, Necroz's Trishula, got released, that effect to banish from hand, field, and grave was so powerful that you could not let that effect resolve either, and players would do everything in their ability to make sure it did not resolve. Very few cards have been impactful as Trishula. There is no doubt about it that Trishula has earned its spot as one of the most powerful dragons of all time. The second last dragon I have on this tier 2 section is not one monster again, but 2. Yes, I know I'm cheating, but we got Black Dragon Collapse Serpent and White Dragon Wyvern Buster, also known as the baby dragons. These chaos dragons require one of the opposite attribute to banish from the graveyard to summon it. Then once they go to the grave, they can add the opposite dragon from your deck to your hand. What these do is essentially enable a ton of chaos plays. They were used to banish Eclipse Wyvern, to search dragons, to banish Thunder Dragon monsters to get those combos off. But through all of that, they've also proved as fusion fodder in Shadal's, synchro fodder in planned synchro decks, and as link fodder in Dragon Link decks. Though these cards by themselves may not be the scariest threats, what they turn into and what they represent is hugely scary, to the point where you would often wince in pain when you saw these cards summoned against you in certain formats. The ease of summoning these monsters, the constant flow of resources, and the number of bodies generated, as well as the very good typing of light and dark level 4 dragons, means these cards are constant threats in the metagame. Being limited now, being banned in Master Duel, it is no wonder these cards place this highly on this list. The last monster I have on this list is a card that I cannot believe is being ranked this low, but unfortunately, it is outclassed by some of its contemporaries. It is none other than Judgment Dragon. Yes, I know, this 2007, 2008, 2009 period had a lot of very powerful dragon monsters. If for some reason you haven't heard of this card, it is one of the most famous dragons of all time. Released in Light of Destruction, if you had 4 Lightsworns or more in your graveyard with different names, you can special summon it. Then you can pay 1,000 light points, not once per turn, to destroy all cards on the field. Judgment Dragon has been on and off of the ban list several times. Despite never being banned itself, it did fluctuate between 1 and 2 copies a bit, before eventually being released later on. Despite these hits, Lightsworns itself with the Judgment Dragon did see play across several different formats for years.
Judgment Dragon! You wouldn't believe this!
And it's only until really later on, when better options became available, that Judgment Dragon faded into obscurity. While the card is still playable in modern Lightsworn decks because it is way more accessible now, it is often just used as a Link body or an XYZ body or a fusion body for Enlightenment Dragon. It is nowhere near the threat it once was, though still seeing some play. It still ranks up this highly on the list, however, because of its legacy, how powerful it was for its time, and the fact that it did see play for years after its release. And finally, we have reached the Tier 1 Dragons. These are some of the best dragon monsters ever printed. Starting off, we got one of the most quintessential dragon monsters that have been the backbone of the dragon typing for over a decade. Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon, a card that can be summoned by banishing any dragon from your field, then once per turn reviving a dragon from your graveyard or from your hand. This effect has been errated though, because it used to be a soft once per turn, meaning if you summoned multiple Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragons, you could then use the ability once more. Red of the, as it's been dubbed, has been played in so many dragon decks across time that it is, without a doubt, one of the most impactful dragons ever released. It defines decks like Disaster Dragon, where Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon can be revived off Red Eyes Wyvern, which will then revive other powerful dragons like Blue Eyes or Tyrant Dragon, which would otherwise just not be summonable in inefficient fashion. It saw play in Heretics as ability to extend, in Dragon Rulers sometimes as ability to extend, in Dragon Link as a combo piece to OTK. Despite this card not being the most threatening game-ending dragon of all time, where other dragons definitely have it beat there, the fact that it's been played in so many different dragon decks as a crucial piece of it does mean it's earned this spot as a tier 1 dragon monster. Next up on this list is a card that joins Red MD in the Chaos Dragon deck of old. Back in 2012, this card got printed in a structure deck that was not that well received immediately, but once players realized how to utilize this card, it became a threat. And that is Eclipse Wyvern, a level 4 dragon that when it hits the grave lets you banish a light or dark level 7 or higher dragon from your deck. Then when the Eclipse Wyvern gets banished, adds that dragon to your hand. This card is now banned in pretty much every format. It lets you access some of the most powerful dragon monsters the game has ever seen, including some of the ones we've mentioned before, like Red as Dark Metal Dragon and Judgment Dragon. The card has seen play in several different capacities, being a good card to mill in the Chaos Dragon deck back in 2012, being used in Dragon Rulers as a good discard off of your baby rulers to set up Light and Darkness Dragon, and being used in Thunder Dragon piles later as a chaos way of accessing Chaos Dragon Legionnaire or the Darkest Diabolus. We never got to see what Eclipse Wyvern would do after that because ever since it's been banned, and I'd like to think that if it was legal now, it would only be used for more of the same type of BS. The card doesn't stand out as iconic, but I think it's almost a mistake because this card is one of the most influential dragons of all time. It just doesn't get the love it deserves because it itself is not the card ending the game. That being said, do not be mistaken. The game would be very different if this card had never existed. But as we talk about this chaos type theming, there is another Chaos Dragon monster that I feel like has definitely earned its spot as one of the most powerful dragons, if not cards, of all time. Chaos Ruler, the Chaotic Magical Dragon. A level 8 synchro monster that is completely generic, that once synchro summoned will let you excavate the top 5 cards of your deck. At any light or dark from among those your hand, and put the rest into the graveyard. Then once in the graveyard, you can banish light and dark from your hand or graveyard to summon this card. It also has 3000 attack and is a level 8 Dark Dragon itself, setting yourself up perfectly for future synchro plays like into Hot Red Dragon Archivy. But the big kicker here is obviously the fact you get to mill 5 cards. Most cards with that ability have been axed pretty swiftly. Kelbeck, Yugioh, Kalos, Painful Choice. Only really slow trap cards like Needlebug Nest still exist with the capacity to do the damage that something like Chaos Ruler can. Chaos Ruler on release was received rather poorly because maybe the symptom of COVID and there just weren't good light or dark decks at the time. It shortly became very apparent how powerful this card was, being banned in both the TCG and in Master Duel. And I don't know if it is banned in OCG, but maybe it is. Truthfully, I don't know enough about the format. The amount of advantage that can be generated off one Chaos Ruler was indescribable. And once it resolved, it usually meant the game was over. There were too much resources in the Chaos Ruler players' hands for them to ever fumble the bag. There is no question in my mind that if this card was still legal today, it would still see play in several different decks. The level 8 synchro tag is extremely generic. And right now, not many good level 8 synchros exist that could even remotely compare the power that Chaos Ruler has. The only reason I cannot rank it higher on this list is because its immediate impact on release showed it wasn't so far ahead of its contemporaries in power that it can compete with the other cards higher on this list. Next on this list, we got what would be our 5th ranked highest dragon, and that is Bestial Magnamut. So I didn't include all the Bestials as one on here in this list because I do think there's a clear, very clear difference in power level between Bestial Magnamut and the rest of the Bestial monsters. The ability to banish a light of dark from out of the graveyard to summon the Bestial monsters while being a quick effect if your opponent has a monster themselves is a very powerful effect. However, it's Magnamut's second effect that kind of gets it through the roof in terms of power level. That during the end phase, you can then add any dragon from your deck to your hand, means that this card will be used as a hand trap and then search any dragon card in the game. That is so powerful, it cannot be understated. And yes, it already looks powerful enough that a non-dragon deck can add something like another Bestial, Dearest Worm, that when you get into a dragon deck like Dragon Link and gets to use Magnamut, it just explosion! Cards like Stratos are well regarded for being able to search pretty much anything. So a card that is Stratos, that's a special summon as well, and also an interrupt and a quick effect at all doing that, it's kind of just incomparable how powerful Magnamut is. And despite not being the game-ending terror that something like Flamebird's Dragon might be, people still know that when Bestial Magnamut is in rotation, it is extremely scary and will enable a lot of tomfoolery. Now in OCG, Master Duel, and the TCG, this card is at 1. So it is still legal for play, but it's not going to reign absolutely supreme at 3 like it did in the past. It's arguable that this card should be higher on the list just because it'll probably be a staple for time to come. That being said, the dragons that are still left on this list are just so impactful and so legendary that I feel like Magnamut could just not compare. And the last dragon we have to talk about in the tier 1 section is a dragon that warped Yu-Gi-Oh! It changed everything, and a lot of people demark it as a huge shift in Yu-Gi-Oh's power level. It got released almost 2 decades ago at this point. In Phantom Darkness, we got Dark Armed Dragon. If you don't know what Dark Armed Dragon does, you are living under a rock. Even though it is years old and no longer even close to meta, it was so powerful for its day that it was the bar for what was considered good as far as boss monsters go. It could be special summoned when you had exactly 3 dark monsters in your graveyard, and then you could banish a dark monster from your graveyard, not once per turn, to destroy any card on the field. Back then, nothing could generate as much pressure with high attack monsters that easily, while also being able to get value in blowing up your opponent's resources. It theoretically met its match with the also legendary Judgment Dragon only a few months later, but Dark Armed was still a superior card in many ways, and is a lot more flexible, being locked to darks rather than an archetype like Lightsworn. Dark Armed Dragon quickly became a part of the limited list, where it still saw play in many dark decks that could enable it. Even when it started to get power crept, it saw play frequently as one-ofs in decks that could search it, with cards like Eclipse Wyvern, and Chaos Dragons, and Shaddolls. After about 7 or so years, this card had fallen off into obscurity, where its power level no longer deemed an immediate response. But there's no doubt about it that in its time, this card was so much more powerful than everything else that existed. It demanded such an immediate response to people to play around it and deck build around it, and it forever changed Yu-Gi-Oh! When it was released almost 20 years ago. Next up, we got the top 3 dragons, and if you haven't already figured it out because I haven't talked about them yet, there are a couple dragons smushed into one category because they're very similar to each other. But before that, I got some honorable mentions. Cards that I feel like are worth mentioning because they've had a big impact on the game of Yu-Gi-Oh!, but not maybe as much as the ones I've already mentioned. Flame Vault Guard, one that I feel like really isn't talked about enough because it's just a level 1 vanilla tuner, but for being a random vanilla has seen a lot of play in several different dragon decks. As the only level 1 fire normal monster tuner you can access through Dragon Shrine, Synchro, Search Off Blaster, and yeah, good card that has seen play for several years. Destrudo, the Lost Dragon, the main way of accessing level 7 synchros in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Was once banned and certainly a contender for most powerful tuners of all times. However, because it itself is not the threat, it is often overlooked in terms of how powerful it can be. Stardust Dragon, which was one of the most powerful synchros of its era, had largely shaped the data engine around it in its metagame, leaving cards like Dimensional Prison far superior to cards like Sakuretsu Armor. Phantasme, the Fantastical Dragon, a side deck card that goes in and out of play frequently in the modern metagame. Despite not being the most powerful card that when it comes down, it is constantly a solid card to have in your hand and in your side deck to beat Link strategies. Also worth mentioning is Scrap Dragon, a revolutionary synchro that was one of the first to offer real forms of removal for both monsters and spells and traps. We've also got Galaxy Eye's Dark Matter Dragon, an XYZ monster with 4,000 attack that can be summoned on top of any Galaxy XYZ, therefore any rank 8 pretty much, which would then as a cost send 3 dragons from your deck to the graveyard, setting up a lot of the most powerful OTKs while it was legal. It got banned itself when Thunder Dragon decks started incorporating it a few years back. It can assert prominence as one of the most powerful synchros ever created, a dragon monster that can give you non-targeting and non-destruction removal while also special summoning monsters from the deck. Its not once per turn abilities also mean that you can loop it very frequently. Cards like Odd Eyes Revolution Dragon, Promethean Princess, Royalty Dragons Atlantis, and many more. And Saryuja Skull Drain, a Link 4 once deemed worthy enough of a ban. Being able to reshape your hand as well as summon cards, all while not being once per turn, meant you could do some really broken FTKs with this, some crazy combos, and do some overall degenerate things.
This is ridiculous!
Warlord Savage Dragon, a card that is now banned in the TCG, lets you equip a Link monster from the grave in order to get that many negates equal to its Link rating. It's one of only a few synchro on the negate monsters, and is a worthy endboard piece for pretty much any deck that can summon it. And lastly, Light and Darkness Dragon, a powerful tribute monster that has been used for many years since its release. Being able to negate up to 4 cards, it's reminiscent of Appaloosa, but way older. Being a searchable target for Eclipse Wyvern also meant it was played during Dragon Ruler's prime over a decade ago. With all those out the way, we have reached our top 3 dragon monsters of all time. And I think the 3rd best dragon of all time is, again, not one card, but I'm going to kind of make it close. It's the Guardragons, LP and Agrabah specifically. So the way the Guardragon Link monsters work are simple. They each have the ability that once per turn they can special a dragon monster from either the extra deck, the Banisher Graveyard, or from the deck, depending on which of the Guardragons is using, to a zone that at least 2 Link monsters point to. These Guardragons are the absolute basics for the Dragon Link strategies that dominated the beginning of the Eternal TOS format. These cards would continue to be relevant in Dragon Link plays until they were respectively banned, leaving only Pisty behind. And though many other Dragon hits have left Pisty in the dust, Misty is still a very reasonable card that anytime a dragon deck becomes popular will be played and will be an incredibly important piece of the deck. Though these cards themselves don't represent the massive threats that dragons can output, they provide so much accessibility, and they are a large reason that dragons have been able to rise to dominance so many times over the last few years. And unlike a card like Magnemite or Eclipse Riven, which are very good at searching, these cards can do that searchability, but can be made with any dragon, and being on the action deck means they're always accessible. It is hard to imagine these as not some of the best cards of all time, let alone just best dragon monsters. Next up, the second best dragon of all time is not one, but four. If you haven't already expected it, it is the four dragon rulers: Redox, Tidal, Tempest, and Blaster. Very few cards have ever shaped Yu-Gi-Oh's history the same way the dragon rulers did. Lord of the Tachyon Galaxy back in 2013 really did change Yu-Gi-Oh forever. Nothing in its time compared to the amount of power, the resource, follow-up, extension ability, and interruption power the dragon rulers could provide. And it's incredible that Spellbook of Judgment came out at the same time as being the only thing to remotely match it in terms of power. But in truth, it's only as an anti-meta option that randomly lined up well that they were able to hold their own. Dragon rulers are clearly the more dominant deck. If you for some reason aren't familiar with the dragon rulers, they all share a couple of common effects. They can summon themselves from the hand or graveyard by banishing two other dragons or monsters with the same attribute as the dragon ruler from the hand or graveyard. They also, once banished, can then add any dragon of the same attribute of itself from your deck to your hand. And they also had one bonus effect, and they can discard themselves plus a monster of the same attribute from your hand to the graveyard to Redox, summon a monster, Tempest, add a dragon from deck to your hand, Tidal, send a card from deck to grave, and Blaster, pop a card your opponent controls. These paired with the baby rulers, the attribute counterparts to all the big rulers, meant that you had easy access to rank 7s, constant flow of resources, and a ton of pressured OTK very quickly. Even after several waves of hit, this deck still remained powerful, and the dragon rules got laid to rest with the banning of all four of them shortly after Dark Matter Dragon's release. In recent years, the card pool has gotten so powerful in Yu-Gi-Oh! That dragon rulers are no longer the threat they once were, but they lasted a long time as really powerful cards, and could still keep up as a solid tier 3 rogue option, to be honest, if they got released to their full potential. They still lie on the ban list in TCG, though in Master Duel they have been pretty much unleashed to full power, and are not a huge threat to the metagame, albeit still playable. Even though they may not still have this overwhelming presence on the metagame, the impact they had on Yu-Gi-Oh! And how they reshaped the next few years is not to be forgotten. Even outside of the Dragon Ruler's deck, individual Dragon Rulers within their own attributes still made a large impact. Tidal within the Dragon Rulers, Tempest within Harpies, Blaster within the Vol or Firefist decks, Redox and Yugioh. If these dragons got to be fully released off the ban list, it's not unlikely to then see them being played in attribute-specific decks, if not in their full dragon deck. We've already seen Blaster seeing some play as a gold star target for Tempai, being able to use its hand effect to pop cards and access your Fadra, Padra, and Chandra. But that begs the question, what one dragon do I think is better than everything else here? And there's one dragon I feel like is almost as iconic as Blue Eyes White Dragon. It has been locked away in the ban list so long that almost no other card mentions it, and it has been errata to make sure it can never be the threat it once was. None other than Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End. This card is absolutely legendary, and if you aren't familiar with it, you really aren't a true Yu-Gi-Oh player, and I'm sorry if I'm offending you for this, but how could you not know what this card does? This was pretty much the first unfair boss monster that wreaked havoc on the game. Part of the initial wave of Chaos monsters alongside BLS and Chaos Sorcerer, this monster can be summoned by banishing a light and dark from your graveyard. It's an original effect, said that you can pay 1,000 light points to send all cards from both players' field and hand to the graveyard. Then they'd also take 300 points of damage for every card sent this way, meaning you could send every single card your opponent has in their possession, hand and field, to the graveyard, and then deal like 4,000 or 5,000 burn damage to them. And yes, you would take some damage too, but this is where you set up other combos alongside it. Either your own graveyard effects, or the classic one from back then, the Sangin would go to the grave, add Yatagarasu from deck to hand. Yatagarasu would then attack, and Yatagarasu said when it dealt damage, your opponent would not get a draw phase. So your opponent would now be effectively locked out of the duel forever. Chaos Emperor Dragon, compared to the other cards around its release, is not even close. Its contemporary is Blackluster Soldier were incredibly powerful and good cards, but they still don't stand up to the raw might of Chaos Emperor Dragon. It shaped the format around it, and decks were built to beat and to utilize Chaos Emperor Dragon. Cards like Sinister Servant and other graveyard effects were vital, and it turned into a game of chess almost, where you were trying to stop your opponent from setting up Chaos Emperor Dragon, while you yourself were trying to set it up for your own OTK shenanigans. The card got banned pretty quickly in an emergency ban list, ensuring that it could not wreak havoc on the TCG for many years. No longer being able to use other card effects the same term you use Chaos Emperor Dragon nowadays means that it's not really what it once was. You can't combo it together, which was the whole purpose of it back then. Chaos Emperor Dragon really did mean you were losing the game when it got summoned, and players who had it in their deck were without a doubt at more of an advantage than others. And for years, if you compared card quality to Chaos Emperor Dragon, nothing would stand up. And if we were to remove its errata and bring it back to its old glory and bring it into the modern format, it likely would still see play because of its hand loop ability, an effect that's so powerful even by modern standards. And the fact that it synergizes the graveyard effects, which still is relevant today, means you can play it in almost any deck that can summon it or search it. And there are many ways to search it, whether it be Omni Dragon Brotor, Bistro Magnamut, Melody of Awakening Dragon, or Starliege Seyfert. It means that if you wanted to search this card, you easily could. In my mind, there are very few cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history as impactful as Chaos Emperor Dragon, as iconic, as legendary, and as game-shaping. And I can safely say that Chaos Emperor Dragon is the best dragon monster of all time. So this is the list, guys. You see where I would rank all the dragons ever printed into my current rankings. If you have any changes you would make, let me know down below where you feel like I underappreciated or overappreciated specific monsters with their modern or past contexts. Also, let me know what type of cards you'd like to see me go over in the future. If you like this type of video where we analyze the most powerful cards from Yu-Gi-Oh's current and past, to really dissect what is the most impactful both now and for its time. So with that, how would you all do?